Consider what happens when a population stops debating policy and starts defending identity. When disagreement is no longer a difference of opinion, but a declaration of war. When the other side is no longer wrong but evil. When loyalty to a movement becomes the measure of a person's worth. When symbols replace arguments. When leaders become untouchable. When doubt becomes betrayal. You are not watching something new. You are watching something ancient repeat itself with a different costume. The question is not why it is happening. The question is why it always happens, and whether anyone in any era has ever seen it clearly enough to stop it before it was too late. There is a structural pattern embedded in the archaeology of civilizations. It appears in Rome, in revolutionary France, in the post-colonial nation-states of the 20th century, in the digital democracies of the 21st. It appears in texts written 3,000 years ago with an accuracy that should unsettle anyone who reads them closely. The pattern is this: every society under sufficient pressure converts politics into theology, not metaphorically. Structurally, the mechanisms are identical, the stages are identical, the consequences are identical, and the blindness of the people living through it, that is identical too. Watch what happens in any modern political environment when a movement reaches a certain threshold of intensity. The language shifts. Critics are not just incorrect, they are corrupt, dangerous, morally compromised. The leader is not simply effective. They are chosen, exceptional, uniquely capable of understanding what others cannot. Defection from the movement is treated not as a policy disagreement but as a kind of apostasy. Loyalty tests emerge. Purity spirals tighten. Moderate voices are consumed by the extremes. The center does not hold, not because of external pressure, but because the movement has evolved past the need for one. This is not the language of politics. This is the language of religion without theology, devotion without doctrine, faith without the accountability structures that the oldest religious traditions built precisely to prevent the concentration of unchecked power. And somewhere in that gap, between the devotion and the accountability, civilizations break. Thousands of years ago, a text described this exact transition, not as prophecy, as observation, as a structural warning delivered to a people who had just made a decision that its authors understood with devastating clarity would hollow them out from the inside. The people of ancient Israel came to their prophet Samuel with a demand: "Give us a king." The surrounding nations had kings. The surrounding nations looked organized. The surrounding nations had a figure at the top who embodied the nation, who gave it shape and narrative and power in the eyes of the world. Israel wanted what they could see. They wanted consolidation. They wanted a human center of gravity. Samuel brought the request to God and received an answer that did not lead with anger. It led with diagnosis. "They have not rejected you," Samuel was told. "They have rejected me." Read that carefully, not as theology, as structural analysis. What the text is describing is a transfer of ultimate loyalty from a distributed system with transcendent accountability to a centralized system with human accountability. A system where no single person, no matter how gifted, could claim absolute authority, replaced by a system where authority lived in a man, in a crown, in a lineage. The danger was not the king himself. The danger was what the people were doing internally, what they were seeking. They were not simply requesting governance. They were requesting a human object for their devotion, a visible, concrete, emotionally satisfying center around which to organize their identity. They were converting their political structure into a religious structure, with a man at the altar. Samuel delivered the warning anyway, and it was precise. "This king will take your sons. He will take your daughters. He will take your fields and your vineyards and your best livestock. He will take a tenth of your grain. He will take your servants. And in the day you cry out because of your king," the voice of warning said, "I will not hear you, because this is what you chose." The people did not hear the warning. They said, "No, we want a king like the other nations." That phrase, "like the other nations," is not a minor detail. It is the entire mechanism. The desire was not for better governance. The desire was for belonging, for equivalence, for the psychological comfort of conforming to the dominant political structure of the surrounding world. They wanted to look like everyone else. They wanted to feel normal. They wanted the anxiety of uncertainty replaced by the clarity of a crown. They were not asking for a policy. They were asking for an identity. And the text gave them exactly what they asked for, along with every consequence that followed. What makes this pattern terrifying is not that it leads to bad kings. It is that it leads to bad kings who feel like salvation. Saul, the first king of Israel, was not a villain by nature. He was tall, impressive, capable. He inspired confidence. He looked like what people imagined a king should look like. And for a time, he functioned. But something in the architecture of his position was already fracturing. Because the same psychology that demanded a king, the psychology that transferred ultimate loyalty to a human figure, also created a king who could not tolerate limits, who could not hear correction, who could not absorb the structural accountability that had existed before him. Power without transcendent accountability does not remain stable. It expands. It becomes defensive. It consumes the mechanisms designed to check it, not always through malice, but through the gravitational logic of its own existence. Saul began to perform religious functions without religious authority. He began to make decisions that were the exclusive domain of a different office, not because he was uniquely evil, but because the system had been designed without adequate separation of functions, and the humans inside it did what humans do when the walls between domains are unclear. They cross them. Now bring this forward. Watch the modern political landscape, not through a partisan lens but through a structural one. Watch what happens to institutions when a movement reaches devotional intensity. Oversight mechanisms are described as persecution. Accountability structures are reframed as attacks from enemies. The judiciary, the press, the academy, the civil service, any institution capable of applying structural friction to power, is systematically delegitimized. Not always through law, often through narrative, through the steady erosion of public trust in any entity that does not confirm the movement's self-image. This is not left. This is not right. This is the pattern. It occurs across the political spectrum, across continents, across centuries. The specific ideology is interchangeable. The structural mechanism is identical. When political identity reaches religious intensity, the first casualty is always the capacity for internal correction. Because internal correction requires the possibility of being wrong, and movements that have become devotional cannot be wrong. To be wrong would be to destabilize the faith. The second biblical case study is more precise. It is the story of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, who inherited the kingdom at its peak and destroyed it within days through a single decision. The people came to him at the beginning of his reign with a legitimate request. His father Solomon had been brilliant but demanding. The labor requirements had been heavy. The people asked for relief. They wanted a lighter hand. Rehoboam consulted his father's senior advisors. They told him clearly, "If you serve this people and speak good words to them, they will be your servants forever." He rejected that counsel. He turned instead to the young men he had grown up with, men whose identity was built around him, whose status was tied to his elevation, who had no framework for governance beyond the extension of the power they associated with. And he told the people, "My father made your yoke heavy, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, I will chastise you with scorpions." The kingdom split. The 10 northern tribes walked away. The unified structure that had taken generations to build fractured in a single conversation. Because the man at the center could not hear counsel that required him to be smaller than he imagined himself to be. Notice what destroyed the kingdom. Not an external enemy, not an economic collapse, not a natural disaster. A leader surrounded by people whose loyalty was based on his exaltation rather than his effectiveness. A leader who had confused devotion with competence. a leader who had been insulated from reality by the very apparatus of power that was supposed to serve the nation. The warning embedded in this account is not moral, it is architectural. Systems built on human devotion rather than institutional accountability always develop the same blind spot. The blind spot is the leader's capacity for self-correction. Because the devotional apparatus requires the leader to be, at some level, above correction, infallible, uniquely perceptive, specially equipped in ways that ordinary accountability structures cannot appreciate. And the moment a leader begins to operate from that premise, consciously or not, the structural warnings around them begin to fail. The advisors who could correct them have been replaced by mirrors. The institutions that could check them have been reframed as enemies. The population that could hold them accountable has been divided into believers and apostates. And the collapse, when it comes, will not feel like collapse. It will feel like purification. Here is what the pattern ultimately reveals, and this is the layer that most analyzers miss. The problem is not the leader. The leader is a symptom. The structural failure begins in the population. In the moment when a society's anxiety becomes so high that it converts its need for security into devotion to a human figure. When uncertainty becomes unbearable. When complexity becomes intolerable. When the desire for a clear enemy and a clear champion overrides the slower, more demanding work of institutional governance. The Bible does not primarily warn about kings who seize power. It warns about populations who demand one, because the demand always precedes the tyrant. The theology of political devotion is always built from the ground up by ordinary people, under ordinary pressure, making ordinary psychological decisions that aggregate into something none of them individually chose or foresaw. They wanted safety, they wanted clarity, they wanted someone who looked like strength. They got a crown. Then they got a dynasty. Then they got the consequences the text had described in precise, structural, preemptive detail, and they cried out exactly as predicted. The most dangerous stage of any civilization is the one where it believes its devotion is different, where it believes that this time the leader truly is exceptional, that this time the movement truly is righteous. That this time the warning does not apply because the warning was written for people less aware, less justified, less certain than we are. That certainty is not a sign of strength. It is the final symptom. The text does not end with punishment. It ends with a question embedded in the silence after the warning is given and ignored. The question the text never asks directly, but the one that every account within it presses forward into the reader's mind. If the pattern is this consistent, if the warnings are this old, if the mechanism is this clearly documented across civilization after civilization, what does it mean that we keep arriving at the same place? What does it mean that the people who can see it most clearly are almost never the ones with the power to stop it? And what does it mean that the moment the devotion feels most justified, most earned, most righteous, most necessary, is almost always the moment it is most dangerous? The pattern does not require malice to function. It only requires belief.